Let us praise the Emperor and prepare to purge his foes with holy fire. Today we're seeing how the forces of the Ecclesiarchy are faring, with an overview of the Adepta Sororitas in 9th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Now 9th edition has been out for a few months, I thought now would be a good time to revisit the Sisters, who have established themselves quite nicely as one of the stronger armies to beat in Warhammer 40k. In the video we'll talk over some of the general strengths and weaknesses of the faction, some of the strongest orders of the Sisters, their unique special rules including stratagems and relics, have a quick stroll through the codex and talk through each unit, and round up with one example army list for 9th edition. Plenty to discuss here, so let's get stuck into a faction overview of the Nuns with Guns. So first up, Sisters of Battle are one of the stronger factions in 9th edition, at least in terms of tournament performance. I feel like right from the start their codex was really quite well written, pretty much the entire dex is usable in one form or another, and they've transitioned quite nicely to 9th edition with its increased focus on infantry holding objectives and decently powerful melee units to sweep the enemy clear of them. In the game at the moment they've really benefited from the melter and flamer changes, having 12-inch flamers and 2-shot multi-melters are absolutely great, and that FAQ that improved them seemed pretty much tailor-made to the Sisters. I quite like the way that they aren't absolutely shoehorned into one build. Perhaps the strongest way to play Sisters is to include at least some Bloody Rose melee units, but they can certainly have a big focus as a shooty army as well, piling on the heat with multi-melters and flamers in armies such as Valorous Heart for a really tanky gun line, or the Order of Our Martyred Lady for some extra miracle dice. Talking of those, miracle dice are a really nice and cool little unique mechanic, can give you a really powerful boost where you need to, and we'll go through them in a second. And they've got plenty fairly standout damage dealer units at the moment, Retributors with their excellent melter, Repentia with their amazing chainswords and melee, the all-round dangerous threat that Mortifiers present, and Exorcists providing some really solid anti-tank. In terms of weaknesses, I'd say generally as a faction they aren't all that capable in melee besides their dedicated units. They're only strength 3, and only having toughness 3 will mean that their squads will fold at least fairly easily to things like bolter fire. Playstyle wise, I feel like the army is quite similar to Space Marines in a lot of respects, but aren't quite as forgiving in melee, and maybe a little bit more dependent on your units being well positioned. Still though, when it all comes together, the result can be very scary in a tournament list. So first of all, let's talk about general army rules, such as orders and sacred rites versus allies. I mentioned them all previously. Bloody Rose, Valorous Heart and Our Martyred Lady are my favourites, and I'd say that they're the most competitive, though I'm certainly not saying that the others can't be good for certain units or certain builds. I would say that Bloody Rose is probably the strongest. They get you extra AP and melee on the charge and an extra attack on the charge, basically just turning up any melee unit into a bit of a monster, and their stratagem for +1 to wound is great as well. Any Sisters melee unit just hits several times harder with Bloody Rose. An extra pip of AP, attack, and +1 to wound is a combo that's just going to stack a whole load more damage on the enemy. Valorous Heart gives you 6+ Feel No Pain on the whole army, and also ignoring AP -1, though it's extra nice as you can go up to AP -2 if you have a nearby Imagifier. For me that makes the rule a lot more useful, and you might be able to shrug off quite easily a decent amount of the enemy's shooting. If not wanting the melee might of Bloody Rose, then just having solid more durable units is generally a good thing. Finally, I'd say that Our Martyred Lady is perhaps a little bit less specific, but generally quite good in any army that's got multiple squads of infantry in it. If they lose a casualty, then they'll hit on 2s, and you also get some extra miracle dice if the whole squad is destroyed. Both of these are different buffs, though maybe not something to build around quite as much perhaps. It is also quite nice having access to Junitha Rita, who's a really good buffing character. Sacred Rites are the abilities that you get if you have a pure Sisters of Battle army, one that doesn't mix with other allies that aren't from an order. I would describe them as solid but not absolutely essential. You have the choice between either picking one of them or rolling for 2. My favourites being the Passion, Hand of the Emperor and Spirit of the Martyr. The Passion will get you extra hits on 6s in melee, pretty much a flat damage increase whenever you get to use it, so particularly murderous even on top of what Bloody Rose can already achieve. Though again, Hand of the Emperor is really good for melee armies, it gives you +1 to advance and charge, so it'll make combats happen just that bit more reliably. I think both have their merits, either you have more reliable charges, or your units deal even more damage when they get there. If running a more ranged style army, I'd be more tempted by Spirit of the Martyr. On a 5+ you get to shoot or attack when you die, and sometimes even a little bit of shooting in the opponent's turn can be really powerful. You might have the chance to try and hit an exposed unit that was just about to shoot or just about to charge. As I said though, while they're nice, I don't think that Sisters are quite as heavily penalised for allying as say Space Marines are. and you've got a lot of scope within the Imperium to build a different flavour of list, maybe allying in something like some scary Admech long-range firepower, some Blood Angels Sanguinary Guard for a different sort of melee approach, or anything else from Custodes Imperial Guard or Imperial Knights. Next, let's focus on some other strong rules for the army, including Miracle Dice, Stratagems, Warlord traits, and Relics. First up, I think the Miracle Dice are really quite powerful for achieving certain actions automatically. I think perhaps the highest yield use of a Miracle Dice is auto-passing a charge, particularly say if you're trying to make a charge from reserve, then you can sub in a couple of Miracle Dice and make that charge for guaranteed if you can make it a 9 or more. The difference between making and not making a charge is absolutely enormous in terms of damage on the enemy, so certainly a really good outlet for them. Otherwise though, automatically wounding the enemy, getting some damage rolls of a 6 on those multi-melters, maybe using some 3s or 4s to save some saving throws, and if you get any really low results then you can use them for morale tests. I think you can have some Sisters armies that go very heavy on them, or don't really have too much focus and just use them as a bit of an optional extra, but either way they make the army stronger. In terms of stratagems, much like many of the other more recent Codex releases, the Sisters stratagems are often linked to a given unit or option. I'm not sure it's worth focusing on every single one for every given unit here, but out of the general purpose ones, I really like the Purity of Faith one. That's the one that gives you a 4+ chance to deny a key psychic power, and it can really screw with your opponent's battle plans. Holy Rage can allow you to advance and charge. Again, as we just mentioned, making a charge or not making a charge can be really key, and if it costs you just 1 extra CP to have a much higher chance of making it, then it's often going to be worth it. Finally, I think that Moment of Grace can be really powerful in the right situation, particularly in combination with the 6+ invul save that Sisters get. It's quite nice to basically be able to auto-save something like a Melter Shot if you do roll just below your invul save threshold. For Warlord traits, some of my favourite are Beacon of Faith and Indomitable Belief. Beacon of Faith just generates you more Miracle Dice every single turn, and we've already mentioned how useful those can be. And Indomitable Belief is the one that soups up your infantry's invul saves, giving you +1 to your Shield of Faith save for infantry units within 6 inches. You can buy an extra one in for just 1 command point, and if you're missing either of these, then it's very tempting to pick the other one up. For a more fighty Canoness, I do quite like Righteous Rage as well. It only buffs the Canoness themselves, but it allows you to advance and charge, and also, perhaps more importantly, re-roll the wound rolls for your attacks in melee, which is a godsend to the Sisters with their low strength. Really nasty in combination with that Relic Power Sword, or Beneficence the Bloody Rose Chainsword. In terms of relics, there's quite a few fun and useful ones, though I'd say perhaps the most competitive are the Litanies of Faith that allow you to re-roll a Miracle Dice per turn, and is a nice one to have around if you are going down the Miracle Dice pathway. The Book of St. Lucius is also just generically good, plus the inch to aura range means that your Sisters will be able to position a bit better. It's useful on a Canoness, or perhaps on the Imagifier for their Tale of the Stoic. Finally, Beneficence, that Bloody Rose Chainsword, is pretty much the Teeth of Terror in another form. It gives you +1 to your strength, AP -2 and damage 2, and then +3 attacks. With the Bloody Rose combat buffs, you're going to be up to 8 attacks hitting on 2s, maybe re-rolling wounds if you have Righteous Rage, AP -3, and you could maybe even have +1 to wound if you use the Bloody Rose stratagem. It's quite nice to have the thought that your single Canoness for 50 points could quite easily take down half a squad of Space Marines if she should so choose to. So let's go through the units in the Codex then, and we'll start out with the HQ choices and their supporting elites characters. I'm quite happy to say that I think that pretty much every choice on this list is pretty usable, and I think that the Canoness and Imagifiers are particularly good value for the points. Canonesses are only 50 points base, give you that very nice reroll aura which can still apply to exorcists and things until we get core on the units, and can be tooled up in a number of fun ways, whether to deal a few mortal wounds with their braziers, or to be a bit fighty in melee with a relic power sword. I think it's going to be a very rare Sisters list that doesn't include at least one Canoness. They're just very good value for that reroll 1's aura, if nothing else. Junitha Rita is a bit of an alternative for the Order of Armata Lady. She's a bit tougher and packs some heavy flamers as well, and she's basically just a much better buffing character, rerolling 1's to hit and wound for nearby units. I'd definitely consider her as an alternative to the normal Canoness, if you do happen to be playing that order. Celestine is as always a very nice fast moving melee threat. She can make the Shield of Faith for nearby units just that little bit better, and of course when she dies, odds are she'll be back, allowing you to be perhaps a bit more gung-ho with her and force your opponent to deal with her, before perhaps being a little bit more conservative the second time round. The Triumph is a model I'm a little bit 50-50 on. It is a fair amount of points and doesn't do all that much damage in melee, though it does provide a whole ton of random useful buffs, and it has so many rules and defensive abilities that it's really quite hard to gun down. It has made its way into some competitive lists that have done well in tournaments, and of course the model is very cool. Missionaries and preachers are kind of two sides of the same coin. They both give you an aura of the +1 attack, which is the main thing, and for me the decision between them kind of depends whether you want the HQ slot or the elite slot to be filled. A very solid melee buffing unit, particularly with units like Repentia. Finally, I do really like Magifiers with the Tail of the Stoic. Ignoring that pip of AP is really handy, and it's particularly good on Valorous Heart. They're not a bad little unit to have some Warlord traits and relics on, and I think they're very good value for how many points you pay. For me, the buffing characters I'm a bit less sold on are the Hospitallers and the Dialogus. I'm not saying they're not useful, but they're probably last on my list for ones to pick up after the ones above. Now let's move on to the Sisters shooting and melee infantry units. The core of the army is of course the Battle Sister squads, and they most typically seem to be played at the moment in small 5-woman units, good annoying little threats to secure objectives with OBSEC, and maybe do things like doing actions. It's quite nice that those Simulacrum Imperialis upgrades are free as well, meaning that they can be quite easy to use Acts of Faith on. With OBSEC, I think that most Sisters lists are going to need at least a few of these, though they do have to compete against Celestians and Dominions for the same role, at least in terms of damage dealing. The Celestians cost 1 point more, they lose OBSEC, they gain an extra attack, and if they're next to Canonesses, then they get to reroll all hits. The last bit just makes them spectacularly better damage dealers than the Battle Sister squads, meaning that if you're not really wanting OBSEC, I'd typically say that Celestians are the way to go. If you are investing a lot of points in upgrading a squad, I'd be more tempted to make it a Celestian squad compared with a standard Battle Sister squad. Dominions are of course the fast attack sisters. Again, they lose OBSEC compared with the standard sisters, but they gain access to more special weapons and also get that Vanguard move to move before the game begins, to maybe try and get those special weapons in range. I'm personally not quite as sold on the Dominion squads compared with the Battle Sisters or Retributors, though I guess a cheap squad or two could be annoying for trying to screen and hold up the enemy right from turn 1. For actual serious infantry firepower though, nothing really stands up to the Retributors. They went up a couple of points in the recent points adjustments, but they remain monstrously efficient anti-tank, with multi-melters hitting on 3s that can move and fire for 2 shots each, and on the first turn that they strike, you can pile them with 2 Armorium Cherubs as well to have 2 of those multi-melters shooting twice. Point for point, they're not all that hard to take down, but for their initial alpha strike, there are very few units in the entire game of 40k that put out more anti-tank damage. These girls will do more anti-tank damage per point than Eradicators on the first round of shooting, which kind of says a bit for how efficient they are. A few squads of these with multi-melters are a very easy include in most Sisters lists. They're likely to trade out very well with your opponent if you can get them in range, maybe by using Strategic Reserve. Finally, for more shooting orientated units, we have the Fast Seraphim, who I think got a slightly punishing points increase in the transition to 9th, and I'd typically be most tempted to use them for a fast moving melter delivery system, packing 4 Inferno pistols within a small unit of 5. They're a bit more survivable than Retributors point for point, and they can potentially do nuisance charges into the opponent, and if they don't fall back then maybe fry them with some pistols in melee. I think competitively their role is a little bit limited, but with their stratagem to jump in and fire a bunch of Inferno shots around, they can't go too far wrong. For melee infantry, Repentia caught a very slight nerf in the recent points adjustments, going up 1 point, though honestly for how monstrously efficient their melee is, this doesn't really make all that much of a difference. A few fairly large squads in Rhinos, backed up by a character or two, will provide some of the best melee damage in 40k, particularly with Bloody Rose and one of the melee Sacred Rites active, and then if you need to, you can potentially fight twice for 3 CP. Their Strength 6 Eviscerators with 2 damage are going to be efficient against virtually everything. A couple of units of these girls in Rhinos is kind of a threat that your opponent can't ignore, and will really punish them from putting anything in charge range, and you can even think about outflanking squads, and then use Miracle Dice to help them make their charge from Strategic Reserve. The other Sororitas melee unit are the Zephyrim. They've now received a points drop themselves as well, they're only 18 points, and with the Power Sword upgrade, they've now gone to Strength 4 and can reroll all wound rolls. Despite having power armor and a 5+ invul, I would still describe them as fairly fragile, though maybe a little bit less so than Repentia. They're certainly very fast, can reroll charges with their pennant, and are pretty efficient against heavy infantry, though they will struggle a bit against vehicles. Again, very usable, but I think about using maybe 1 unit of them as a utility unit, rather than say having 3 big units of them in the list. Finally, for infantry units, we also have Battle Conclave units, who I'm afraid I'd argue are a little bit behind Repentia and Zephyrim in terms of their usefulness within the Sisters' decks. They're certainly not terrible, but I think I would rather have Repentia in pretty much most circumstances. Perhaps one niche role for them can be with 2-man units of Crusaders or Death Cult Assassins, and use them as cheap little chaff units that are really easy to hide, doing actions so your sisters don't have to. and maybe doing annoying secondary objectives like trying to hide in table quarters, or just screening and move blocking in front of the enemy army. Overall though, I think the Games Workshop have done a pretty decent job of making almost every unit in the Battle Sister roster really useful, maybe some more so than others, but there's usually at least a niche role for every unit in the decks. Finally, for units we get onto the vehicles, but again I'd pretty much argue that every one of these choices is pretty good. For transport purposes, my first choice would usually be the Rhino, and as I said, I'd usually want a bunch of Repentia inside who synergize really well as they're not very tough and really need the protection. The Immolator packs some really heavy firepower though. It could be a good transport unit for some Retributors, keep them safe on the enemy turn 1, and then pop out to fry some vehicles on yours. In 9th edition, dedicated firepower tanks don't have all the best success, but I think that the Sisters Exorcists are fairly good for bucking this trend. Pretty much nothing wants to get hit by 3d3 anti-tank shots, particularly as they can receive some decent buffs like re-rolling 1s and ignoring AP-1 and AP-2 if they're Valorous Heart with an Magifier nearby. They're pretty much the only choice for really long-ranged anti-tank in the Sisters army, but at least they're a good one. I'd say definitely not mandatory, but a squadron of 2 or 3 within the list is rarely going to be that bad a choice. Finally, we have some of my favourite units in the entire decks, the Penitent Engines and the Mortifiers, who for their points just have a ludicrous amount of damage output. I'm really liking the Penitent Flails. Take 2 of those and you have a whopping 15 strength 6 attacks at AP-2 coming out of every single death machine. Mortifiers are only 60 points and can pack 2 heavy bolters on top of that, and Penitent Engines are only 50 points, packing twin heavy flamers. Of the 2, I think that Mortifiers are the stronger. With 2 heavy bolters, they're really not all that bad as ranged firepower units, never mind their absolutely devastating melee. Penitents are cheaper, not quite as destructive and a lot more short-ranged, but are also a lot tougher than the Mortifiers point for point due to having a 5+ feel no pain. I suspect that one of the only reasons that we don't see these guys run more is that they're really quite expensive to get the models together. They're quite expensive money-wise and very cheap points-wise. Finally, I thought I'd just mention the Battle Sanctum. Basically for this you're just paying a few extra points to generate more miracle dice, and I guess it can be helpful to have an extra bit of light cover in your deployment zone somewhere. For me it still feels like a fair amount of points, but it has made an appearance or 2 in some decent performing tournament lists, which implies that it can be useful if you're really going for a miracle dice heavy build. Overall, I think the Sisters of Battle Codex is a really good example of good internal balance. There are a few absolutely standout options that sweep all the others aside, and most of the units have their role in one way or another. Finally, I thought we'd just end with an example list. This is one that I've put together myself. I'm sure it might be optimized even further. I've taken a little bit of inspiration from lists that have done well at tournaments. I've decided to break it down into a Valorous Heart Battalion and a Bloody Rose Patrol. Basically everything that's melee focused goes in the Bloody Rose Patrol, and all the shooter units go in the Valorous Heart Battalion to make them tougher. For Sacred Rites, I'd go with one of the melee buffs, either +1 to charge or exploding 6s. For the Firebase, we have the Valorous Heart Canoness, who has that Beacon of Faith trait for extra miracle dice, supported by an Magifier with Indomitable Belief and the Book of St. Lucius. Their aim will mainly be to buff 2 big squads of Celestians, both 10 Sisters strong, and both packing an extra multi-melter for a little sting of anti-tank. They'll be re-rolling everything and really hard to shift. They'll have 5+ invols from Indomitable Belief, ignoring AP-1 and AP-2, and also the 6+ Feel No Pain type save from Valorous Heart. In addition, getting into the buff auras if they can, but not worrying too much if they can't, we have 3 units of 5 Battle Sisters. Their job will be to do the grunt work, securing objectives and doing actions, and providing a little bit of bolter fire while they're doing it. We then have 2 units of 5 Retributors, each of which have 3 multi-melters and 2 Armorium Cherubs. We'll make a decision before the game and decide whether we want to put them in strategic reserve or perhaps just lurk them out of line of sight in a ground floor ruin. From there we move on to our melee threats. The Bloody Rose Patrol is led by a Canoness with Beneficence, and both she and a Missionary will start in one of the Rhinos, where we have 2 Rhinos, each with 8 Repentia in them each. These will trundle up the board looking very dangerous and daring the enemy to get too close. Alongside them, providing some anti-horde fire support and really big charge threat, we have 3 units of 2 Mortifiers, more annoying little threats for the opponent to deal with, and if they ignore them, then any infantry about are going to get mowed down. Finally, for a bit more fast-moving melter support, we have 2 units of Seraphim, just small squads of 5, each packing 4 Inferno pistols. In most games they'll aim to deep strike and use the stratagem to fire out of deep strike with the Inferno pistols, though again, if the matchup suited it better, they could potentially start on the board. Could be a handy little unit to spring forward and punish enemies that get too close to the battle line. Overall, I think that this will be a fairly reasonable take-all-comers list, a bunch of big melee threats, a very decent amount of multi-melta fire, and a decent amount of Auspex squads to run about stealing objectives. I guess my main concern would be if the attack wave mainly got focused down, and the Celestians got kind of ignored, which might be a bit of a waste of their durability boosts. I'm sure it's not the most optimised Sisters list in the world, but I think it at least looks fairly scary on paper, and it's been fun to have a mess around with army building. So let me know your thoughts on the Adepta Sororitas down in the comments below. I hope your orders have been faring well in 9th edition so far, and will continue to do so in the future. Whenever they do happen to get a new codex or new models, I'll certainly be looking to cover them on the channel, so feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Finally, if you've been enjoying my videos and you'd like to help support the channel, I would just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Making all of these videos does take a fair amount of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel Patreons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the Auspex Tactics prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.